Welcome to Meadowlarkers 74. 74. Goodness.
Wow.
70, 74. We
Huh.
have Kate Fagan here, looking stylish as usual. I can't tell who you're repping underneath that cardigan. What do we got there? You have to tell. I don't even know.
AC Milan, AC
AC
Milan.
Milan, got it.
Mm.
Got it. We got Amin Al Hassan. I can't see what you're repping there, but
What's Amin doing?
what is he doing? It
Uh,
usually
He's got
says
a
a
gray
Star Wars
hoodie
reference,
on.
but it's just a gray hoodie.
yep.
And he's not even going to cooperate and lean back or whatever to give us a shot of what
No.
it is. It's
Mm-mm.
How
just,
much? How much further?
I see
Well,
some.
yeah. I mean, I didn't
Oh,
know if there was a T under
it is.
anyway.
This is
Great
this is
content.
called
Here we go.
festival merch. I went to the Dreamville Festival, and I walked away with some merch, and this is one of the things.
Is
This
it
is one
swag
of
or
the hoodies.
merch?
It is the definition of if it comes
Church.
swag becomes merch when you pay for it,
That's
right?
right. Swag is
Yeah.
free.
Yeah. So it's swag.
It's so it's swag. He was modest. He didn't want to admit it. It is swag. I am repping nothing. This is Howard Bryant, and I have nothing. I'm just wearing a sweatshirt. Um, what do we've got here? We've got honorary captains for 74. 74. Let's go 74. Let's go with the Philadelphia Flyers were the first expansion team in NHL history to win the Stanley Cup, beating the Boston Bruins in 6 games. 74 is also Dallas Cowboys Hall of Famer Bob Lilly. We also have 74 would be noted Los Angeles Dodgers closer Kenley Jansen, who has now since moved on to the Atlanta Braves and now currently the Boston Red Sox. Boston Bruins winger Jake DeBrusk, 74. Any more 74s out there of note?
I'm happy to report there has never been a number 74 in the history of the National Basketball Association.
The National, not one. Not one, but we'll get a 75 next week, won't we?
No 75s either.
No 75s either. I know we had Rodman, and then of course
73 was Rodman. Yeah,
and then 76 we'll go Sean Bradley, and 77
Yep.
Luca, and then we can go from there. But all right.
Oh, George Mirazon. How quickly they forget.
And how quickly they forget. Yes. What would be, we thought, and what has been for the last couple of weeks has been a celebration of something Kate Fagan has been saying for years now. If you put the women on, they will draw. And boy, did they ever draw. And boy, did they ever deliver. And boy, did we have a great tournament. However, what are we talking about now? Instead, we're talking about class and gestures. We're talking about Caitlin Clark. We're talking about Angel Reese. We're talking about all the things that have brought us back to the double standard of what we're talking about with women's sports versus the men versus how you're supposed to behave and all of these things. We've got a gazillion thought pieces over the last, 72 hours over following LSU's victory over Iowa in the championship game, which, by the way, was a pretty comprehensive romp. I mean, that's one thing that people really aren't talking about is that LSU put on a show. Kate, where do we begin with this? I mean, thought piece after thought piece. Let's just sort of do the setup, which is in as LSU was moving toward confirming its championship. Angel Reese makes the gesture. First, the hand over the face, the you can't see me gesture, and then the pointing at the ring finger. In other words, I'm a champion and you are not. We are the champions once again. And that set off firestorm.
Yeah.
Anybody that watches basketball sees this as basic sort of end of game trash talk, which is not remarkable at all. But please, Kate, for everybody in the back, why is this such a big firestorm?
Oh, well, I think it's a big firestorm because probably something like 8 million new people walked through the door on Sunday afternoon because the rating on ESPN was 9.9 million. And, with peak of, I don't know what it was, 12 to 13 million. And that was an insane number compared to the next highest NCAA championship game was like 5.5 million. And that was back when Sue Bird was in college playing for UConn. I think that was the 2001 NCAA title game. So you're talking about
So we're talking 20
doubling,
years.
Yeah, 20 years and doubling a number. So, whenever you have however many million people walking through the door, many of them not paying attention at all to either the storylines of the tournament, the storylines of that season, and then the ongoing storylines of women's college basketball. And then you're bringing with it preconceived notions about what the women's game should look like and how players in the women's game should act. I will note that we played at the top of this episode a segment from a podcast I do with Jessica Smetana, Off the Looking Glass. It's a segment we call Campfire, where we let somebody tell a story from the annals of history. And the voice you heard was that of Cheryl Miller, telling the story of her struggles with Pat Summitt on the 1984 U.S. Olympic team. And I thought that was important to play because that was almost 40 years ago. And the story Cheryl Miller is telling about how her quote unquote antics as a Black player coming out of California, playing for the University of Southern California, alongside Cynthia Cooper and, a number of other like really dominant players, that Cheryl Miller was doing things like cartwheels on the court in front. I mean, she did a cartwheel in front of Pat Summitt's bench after beating the University of Tennessee in the NCAA tournament. And Pat Summitt was not a fan of what she thought was sort of more like me-centric behavior. And then Cheryl had to sit down with Pat Summitt in the lead up to the U.S. Olympic team. And Pat was like, why do you got to do all that? I mean, and that sounds very familiar to us now. Like, why you got to be extra? And Cheryl saying, like, that's how I play. Where I grew up, that's how I play. I play with joy and I play with my emotions on my sleeve. And, Pat's from a farm in Tennessee, sort of like that like Midwestern, Southern American white mentality of like, you're like act like you've been there before kind of vibes. And the two clashed. And I think that was a good campfire, like to play ahead of this Angel Reese, Caitlin Clark 2023 NCAA discussion, because it's an ongoing discussion in sports in general when we talk about like stereotypes that we have about players and races in our games, and like we're not devoid of that in women's college basketball. And so that's one reason we played that at the top. But and I have lots of thoughts about this that we can get into, but I did want to ask Amin, like right off the bat, do you think that if this interaction had happened in the NBA or at the end of the men's NCAA tournament, that anybody is discussing it at all, or is it just seen as part of the game? Like, how much of it do you think plays in that, like, we quote unquote expect better from our ladies? Did you think that played into it, or is this just part of sports coverage, right? That like you just get this stuff.
All right, so I'm going to quote two people who work on the Le Batard Show. First of all, I'm going to quote Tony Calatayud, who's coined the phrase, real hoopers know. That wasn't anything, as Howard said, that was as basic gets, right, in terms of trash talk. But more importantly, it was like targeted, right? It was targeted at someone who was renowned for talking trash. And in that regard, I submit to you, even though the conjecture and the conversation that happened afterwards was toxic, I'm going to quote Chris Cody and say, this was a good thing, because it represents, for a brief moment in time, all the arguing, all the talking was not gender-based. Intersectionality reached, and we finally achieved women's basketball as just basketball. It's not women's basketball, it was just basketball. And instead, we got into a race war. But that's an improvement over a gender war and a race war. So
or in the visibility.
Right. So for a moment in time, for the 2 or 3 for this week, basically, we got to lay to rest women's basketball is boring. No one wants to watch it. Nobody cares. That we put all that stuff is done. No one mentioned any of that. Instead, we talked about This is classy enough or not classy or whatever. And it was in a weird way refreshing. Like, oh, okay, we get to have just a regular, power dynamic conversation around race as opposed to having one about gender as well. And when you look at all the events, the major events that have happened in the last couple of years that this telecast trumped, it is clearly everything has come to fruition. All the things that people like you, Kate, and your podcast Off the Looking Glass have beaten the drum about. So just, it's the quintessential, just give us our shot. Okay, here's your shot. And what'd you do with it? You knocked it out the park. You knocked it out the park so hard that nobody questioned, well, it was this. So none of the qualifiers about gender even got up out of bed. They were done. You knocked it out of the park so hard that we jumped to a regular standard conversation about, classless Black players. Why can't you respect the game like these lily white players? Let's get them to, both teams go to the White House. I was like, wow, this is amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing. And let's get to the setup. There are a couple of things at work here that we always, and we do this on this show, and I think it's always important for us to reiterate. Race, class, and gender are the three third rails of American life. You cannot escape. Now, there used to be a fourth one, and it has receded, and that is religion. It's not as toxic as it used to be, but it's making a comeback, right?
Depends on the religion.
Depends on the religion, exactly. Depends on the religion. And so, but, these are the things that will get you into that Thanksgiving Day table debate, or we don't talk about this at the table, right? Or the barstool debate, we don't talk about this. And so what we saw here, number one, was the superstar. This tournament was dominated by one player. This was Caitlin Clark's tournament. Everywhere you looked, it was Caitlin Clark. And Caitlin Clark balled out. She was phenomenal. She was great. She had people watching the game that hadn't watched the game before. She was exactly what American professional sports, what they engender for all of us, which is give us a name, give us a celebrity, give us something to watch, and suddenly all eyes are on this person. This is happening as Caitlin Clark is playing for the University of Iowa, not the most diverse team in the world. Right. So in some of the ways, you had some of these really interesting dynamics, not that dissimilar to the greatest college basketball game of all time, which is country Larry Bird and city Magic Johnson. You had, country Caitlin Clark going up against, Philly Dawn Staley and her undefeated team in South Carolina. You had, never mind Kim Mulkey, we'll get to her in a second, but you had a predominantly Black team in LSU going up against. So you had these very stark racial dynamics. And that's obviously going to get people talking. But the other thing that you had, which I thought was refreshing in a way because it did bring it back to basketball. It doesn't really have to be about basketball, but this was where I thought the end of the game was really sort of important in its own comeuppance, was you also had other teams. You had people competing. You've got an LSU team that believes they're the best team in the country. You had South Carolina that they're undefeated. They believe they're the best team in the country. They hadn't lost a game in over a year. And so these are competitors first and foremost. And you're watching somebody else come in and steal all the thunder, and you're getting that other vibe that women's sports has gotten. I know Kate and I, we've talked about, not necessarily in always positive terms, but once you get the superstar, and now it's Caitlin Clark. At one point, it was Paige Beckers, it was somebody else out there, but now it's Caitlin Clark, and now all the Twitterverse from the male NBA players are showering on her like they do when Steph Curry goes off or when the other players go off. So now she's elevated above everybody else, and you guarantee that every other competitor in that tournament wants to beat her ass, because now we're talking competition. And finally, now that she's been elevated to the top of the mountain and she's the reason why everybody's watching, LSU is like, we're the reason to watch. You can't tell me that when you're in that LSU locker room, you're like, we're coming to get you. And to me, that's what the real root of that controversy was, pure competition. It was, okay, you're it, we'll beat you by 17. And you watch the way LSU played that game, and you can tell that they were like, not on our watch tonight. I mean, you may have had the last 2 weeks, but tonight is ours. And that's what really came out. And then it turns into this, okay, it's how do we carry ourselves and the rest of that stuff, which I thought was, obviously necessary, because you do have this other dynamic, Kate, where you're talking about, is it a black game? It is in the WNBA. And, when we had Alicia Clarendon on, I was like, she said it's a black queer game. But the college game finds its way to have the white, ponytailed player be in the face of that sport. And so these sort of cultural clashes are taking place on the court. And it did manifest here when everybody's watching, and it's not going away. But what I saw with those two individual gestures was just pure sports. You're the flavor of the month. No. Tonight belongs to us.
Yeah, it was a combination of that, along with some dynamics that everyone who's been paying attention to Iowa all year long in women's college basketball has been feeling. And when I was in Dallas over the Final Four weekend, where the women's Final Four was, and one of the conversations we would have with anytime you're getting together for drinks after certain events was like, can you believe the amount of people coming out of the woodwork for Iowa? And of course we could believe it, right? Like, it wasn't true disbelief, but it was more acknowledging that all of us in all of our various walks of life were hearing from people who had never before supported women's college basketball, and they find themselves drawn to supporting Iowa. And even down there in Dallas, when the teams are walking into the arena or outside their hotels, you have the Iowa contingent, which is, an all white starting lineup, and the Iowa fan base, predominantly a white fan base, and then the South Carolina and LSU fan bases, predominantly a black fan base. And the clashes that were happening about Iowa's place in the game, along with Caitlin Clark's place in the game, like, it was kind of like a simmering discussion all weekend long.
Were you at the final, Kate?
No, we flew home the day of the final. I didn't go to the final.
Okay, you weren't there for the final game.
No, but like, it was interesting because in Dallas, like, this is what we were all talking about. We were talking about, one, Caitlin Clark, who, obviously, it should be said before I say anything else about it, like, 90% of like the shine coming to her is because no one has ever seen anybody play like that before. The way she's playing and the shot she's hitting is unlike anything we've seen in women's college basketball. But like, we were having discussions down there in our little groups about like the attitude check that might be needed from Caitlin Clark. I mean, that not that she needed, like, not like, oh, we need an attitude check like she's 15, but that someone was going to give her an attitude check.
Well, she needed one because
it happened. So then like to have a discussion about like how race was playing, how people were responding to Iowa, plus Caitlin Clark needing an attitude check, and then to have that moment I was like, it justified kind of like what you could feel bubbling around.
Yeah.
And then you have that moment at the end, and you're like, well, yeah, like anyone who was paying attention could see that moment sort of bubbling up.
Let's go to two things. Number one, I'm going to go first big, and then I'm going to go small to you, Amin. The big picture is that from a racial standpoint, especially in a sport dominated by minorities, whatever sport that is, there's always been this racial dynamic of white people needing the great white hope to check the sport. I remember when I was covering baseball, I remember the black players used to get so upset about how, there's been fast black players since the history of black baseball, but yet Mickey Mantle was the fastest. Right? I remember when Larry Bird won 3 straight MVPs in the mid 80s when the game was 80% black, but the best player in the game was white. And then what did that manifest? That manifested into, Game 7, 87, when Isaiah Thomas and Dennis Rodman did their thing on Larry Bird. Well, you know, if he was black, he'd be just another player. We heard Kendrick Perkins talking about this, about, you know, the what whiteness does in the black game, that how, you know, there's this, and I think the great, you know, the late great Ralph Wiley used to talk about this. He used to refer to it as the precious racial dynamic, the need for the white fan to find their superstar and elevate above when a game is being dominated by black players. And you could feel some of that. You could feel some of that. And if you're a competitor, you would absolutely feel some of that. And that, you know, here's Caitlin Clark and here's the all white lineup, you know, and you listen to Don Staley's post game after they lost, you know, it's there. This is something that happens in this country, regardless of the sport, regardless of the subject. There is this need, I guess, in some ways, it's a manifestation of white supremacy in some ways, the necessity to constantly remind you who's the best. And then it manifests in the opposite direction when you finally have somebody black do something, you know, and then it's constant. That dynamic does not change. Race, class, gender doesn't make a difference. You have to address these things. I mean, to the smaller point, when you talk about the attitude check, Kate, if you're in the opposing locker room and you are the coach, I mean, and you're watching Caitlin Clark run over everybody, and you're next.
Right.
What is, of course, the appropriate attitude as competitors? You know, I mean, to be the one to take down the giant, right?
Mm-hmm. So this is one of the things I find most fascinating, right? Is the concept of trash talk. This is like, we're not baseball. This is part of our sport.
It's so
People
funny
do
you
it,
say that. Mm-hmm.
Right? We do it. There is no unwritten rule. And the thing that we say in basketball often, unless you're talking about, you know, middle school basketball or high school basketball, is if you don't like it, if you don't like the way they talk,
you got to ball out.
Go shut them up. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you beat them, they won't be able to do it. And so there's that tenet. And there's also, as a sport, we recognize and celebrate the art of trash talk. We glorify trash talkers. Gary Payton, Larry Bird, Draymond Green, right? There is a level of the trash talk, particularly when you back it up, that we enjoy and celebrate. But at the same time, that coin has two sides, because the other side of that coin is we celebrate it, we tolerate it, whatever you want to call it, because we secretly root for the day
when you get yours.
When you get yours.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we love it. We love it because we're waiting for the day where, today's not your day, and the karmic energy will fall back on you. Caitlin Clark was waving her hand in front of her face all tournament long, and everybody loved the passion, and they should have loved the passion. We love the passion. We love the exuberance, excitement, and part of it is that just, I love playing basketball, and part of it is, hell yeah, look how great I am. Understand, I'm not going to do the humble thing of, oh, shucks, well, I just got lucky today. No. I'm great, and I know it, and you know it too, right? But the other part of that coin is the excitement of seeing it backfire on her. And when Angel Reese looks at her and does it right back to her, that's not in a vacuum. That's not picking on the poor kid when she's down. This isn't someone who is, you know, injured or disabled in any way. This is a competitor who brought her best to the show, and it just wasn't good enough on that day. And all the ghosts of games past where she did this all came and inhabited the body of Angel.
Went around, came around.
And,
you know, and here's the other thing about that, Kate. When you're looking at, I was thinking about that this morning, and actually yesterday too, when we were preparing for this show, is the culture of the sport combining with the culture of the times. And when you play baseball, you draw attention to yourself, you're getting hit in the back, or somebody's throwing the ball at you. Why are they throwing the ball at you? Because baseball is the only sport where the defense controls the ball. So the defense actually gets to police you in baseball in a way that the other sports doesn't happen. You know, what's the defense going to do if you're going to sit there and talk shit? They got to stop you in basketball. Football, they reduce the level of trash talking because the game is so inherently violent, someone's going to bite somebody's finger off. So they just stop that. They're like, okay, we don't do that in this sport. And so there's a whole lot of trash talking going on in football, but one, because you're wearing a helmet, and two, because the game is so inherently violent, and three, I think also because the players know how dangerous the game is, that it's not nearly as pronounced as in basketball. In basketball, because basketball has evolved from Jewish game to country game to urban game to black game, that is an inherent piece of that sport. And mostly because most of the players are barely wearing any clothes, they're on top of each other in terms of like the physical contact. They're constantly communicating with each other, and they're constantly communicating with the referees, and they're constantly communicating with the fans. It's really the most intimate, fastest moving game. Hockey, they solve their problems by like dropping the gloves, right? They just duke it out in hockey at some point. So my question for you is, one, knowing that this is the root of the game, and that combine that with social media today, people love dunking on each other as a part of social media. The clapback, the shutdown, the, you know, who's got the better comeback. All of that is part of it. And then you add to it, today, we are a visual culture. Like part of the reason why baseball has that, the non sort of TV culture, is because it goes back so far. It was not always a TV sport. But today, everything is visual. Everything is about that back and forth, about that clapback, whether we're talking about it on social media, whether you're watching it on TV. At some point, the camera is going to be on you, and there is that competition. So my question for you on this is, I don't know if fair is the right word, but when you're looking at the women's game, as the women's game is now in everybody's face, and now nobody, whenever, I don't know what the calendar says, I don't know if Iowa is playing LSU next season or whatever, but that game's getting circled. Like something is getting, so now we've got games on the women's calendar that we circle. Are we expecting, or should they expect, the women's game to have a different culture than the culture that's out there? It shouldn't be. This is what basketball is, whether it's women's basketball. Because I heard people say, well, I don't know if I like watching women sort of go at each other like that. I'm like, that's basketball.
Yeah.
It's odd.
Yeah. You also didn't, it's not like people were loving it when it was no differentiation,
Well, that's right. And that's the point that you made that I really enjoyed, when you were saying, well, wait a minute, when whatever we were doing before this, you weren't watching it anyway.
Yeah. I mean, and when you were talking about the history of certain sports and trash talking and then coming to basketball, the thing I was thinking was that trash talking has not been a core part of the women's game.
And that
I'm
was
not
my
saying
other question for you.
people weren't doing it when they were playing pickup, or there haven't been players throughout history who maybe leaned into it more than others, but it has not been a generally accepted practice in the women's game in a public-facing way for a number of reasons. One ties into what I just mentioned, which was at various points, the women's game is trying to position itself as like, we're your role models. Like you come and you see the fundamental game where women
play the game the right way.
Play the game the quote-unquote right way. And one, that was never a great position for the women's game to begin with, because we had as many dynamics happening in the women's game that happened on the men's game, right? As many, villains as heroes, as all of those things. It's just that no one was really willing to embrace any different role, because the powers that be were telling a lot of female athletes, like, we only can have good press. We get so little of press that when we have press, we want it to be 2 thumbs up and everybody's supporting us, which
or sex it up.
Yeah, if you go back to you don't even have to go back. That's a constant state of women's sports, is like ebbing and flowing, how we are going to embrace sex appeal in whatever way you define it. But yeah, so And there's another through line of this trash talking element, which is the game itself didn't lend itself to the kind of moments that Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese could create in this final. Like, you could go back 20 years and watch an end of game play, and the way Caitlin Clark could just like bounce off a screen, hit a step back three.
Yep.
You didn't have a ton of players who could do that. And so it wasn't that kind of individual, I have set myself apart kind of energy that Caitlin Clark has carried throughout this year. So for a number of reasons, you have seen a shift over the last couple of years. One is just the pure talent in the game is different than we've seen before. And two is like people like Diana Taurasi, Simone Augustus have paved the way previously to be like, this is bullshit. How you think that we have, like, if we trash talk or if we are flamboyant, that means we're not a quote unquote team player. And I think the women's game has put that mostly in the past.
Well, let's throw this out here, Amin, too. There's another piece.
Well, I was just gonna say, because it's funny, because I worked for the Phoenix Mercury when we won our first WNBA championship. And
do you have a WNBA ring?
I don't. I never got a ring. I never got a ring, and I never got a playoff. And they did. They did.
You never got a share either.
They get a playoff bonus either. So that's another Meadowlarkers episode.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't get my ring.
The plight of the video coordinator, but our team had Diana Taurasi, and we had Cappy Pondexter, and one of our assistant coaches was Bridget Pettis. And when you said, yeah, trash talk hasn't been part of women's game, I was like, what? Because all we did was that. Like, we were
that team for sure. Yeah.
Chirpy. We were a chirpy team. And DT in particular was, again, what I said earlier, great. And I'm going to tell you about it. And I'm going to let you know about it. I'm going to let the ref know about it. I'm going to let the other coach know about it. I'm going to let the fans know about it. And I'm going to back it all up, which was, some of the most incredible things to behold. But I guess my question, Kate, because I like you said in pickup, I mean, this is the culture of the game. Maybe not
for sure
the organized game, but this is the culture of the game. Men or women, it doesn't matter. But when you say it wasn't part of women's basketball, are you saying at the collegiate level? Or are you saying of a certain era? I just want kind of to clarify that.
I'm saying that it was not something the powers that be at the head of the WNBA and the head of the NCAA wanted celebrated and put out there. Like, you would, like, even Diana has always had a strained relationship with the W along the way, because she was what you were saying. Like, she does trash talk. She does embody more of a swagger that at times conflicted with the way the WNBA thought it should sell itself, which was always a mistake. But it thought, yeah, I feel like you have a story now you need to share.
They're gonna bleep this out. I'm just gonna say the setup and then bleep out Jeremy the punchline. Diana once got tossed for a game for telling someone to suck her dick. And that's still to this day one of the funniest things. She hit the shot, she literally suck my dick. Ref was like, you're out of here. But I'm like, we laughed so hard. Because it's just
if you talk about Diana, if you would have highlighted who she was and the way she carried herself on the court, if that would have been seen as an asset, more people would know the stories you're talking about. It's not that I'm not saying that
and
women
if she
haven't
were a dude, they would have been. And so, the other piece of this too is when you're talking about the culture, right? I think there are three things that worth paying attention to. One, trash talk is part of Black culture, period. Right? I mean, that's sort of, there's no place you can go in the Black community and not have somebody talking shit to you. It's just sort of how it works, right?
It starts in the home, Howard.
It's just right. It's just how it is. People capping on people all the time. Remember what do they used to call it? What do the old heads call it? The dozens, right?
Dozens.
People are always cracking on each other. It's just sort of how it is. And I didn't like it. I was not a trash talker because it was just always, just wasn't my way. But if you're going to get on that court, you're going to have to figure out a way to deal with that. And the Madison Avenue part of the world found in the Black game something they could market. And that's the first thing. The second thing is thing that Kate and this pod have been talking about a lot is, where do you get your role models from? And as the game is growing, and then as you add the, when, Kobe Bryant gave the turbo boost to the women's game as well by, taking an interest, a lot of the young female players coming up, they may enjoy, the other female players who have come before them, but a lot of what they're being sold is the men's game. They're being sold that if you want to be a baller, you have to act like the NBA players. And this is what the NBA players do. This is how the NBA players interact with each other. And so what you saw between Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese was no different than what you'd see in a Memphis Grizzlies Golden State Warriors game. And then the other thing that I think is going to really add to this is something, Kate, you just said earlier, which is, as the game becomes more athletic, and as the game becomes more individual, and as the game, because athleticism and individualism go hand in hand. Because once you start having players who recognize, I can take this game over by myself, that's going to create the defensive challenge, whether individually or as a team, to stop that player. And there have been, female players who have been dominant. But the thing that I saw in watching Caitlin Clark that I really said, oh, this may be a moment that we come back to, is the truly individually offensive-minded long-range player. There have been players who can shoot. There have been players who can dominate. There have been players who can dominate down low and all that. But I'm taking the ball from half court, which is the way they play in the NBA now. And I am going to be the attacking offensive player, which is one of the great criticisms that women's basketball has had, that they spend 22 seconds on the shot clock, moving. And Caitlin Clark's a totally different offensive player. And that type of offensive player is going, with that level of athleticism, is going to create a new player, a new challenge, and a new relationship between the offense and the defense. And eventually that raises the level of smack talk too, because the game is becoming, maybe a little more individual and less team in some of those individual matchups.
Oh, I mean, that is spot on in terms of the development of the athleticism and the kind of plays you can see on the women's side now, and how it's going to translate, I think, in obviously broadening the appeal of the game, but also in situations like we saw on Sunday afternoon, because I know you haven't been plugged into the women's game, but since you were in Phoenix, like, you have watched a lot of women's basketball as well. Something has changed over the last decade in the game in terms of, we've always had individual players at spots in the women's game who have been able to do different things than the majority of women's players can. Like, Diana could create her own shot, obviously, but the number of players now and the way they can create shots at the end of games and in specific moments is something that the women's game has often lacked as a whole, is an ability to say, oh, there's 3 seconds left in the game. Like, on the men's side, you're like, that's an eternity. On the women's side, historically, you're like, I'm probably going to end up with like a heave or like something down low that's going to be too congested. Not anymore. I think, and Caitlin Clark to me is like the next level of player who can do this kind of thing. But in the last couple of years when I watch the game now, I can name you 20 players who could create their own shot at any moment, at any time in a game. And that has not always been true.
And have it be a good shot.
Yes.
Have it be like a real shot.
And make the shot. Yes.
Yeah. Diana and Cappy were rarities at the time, because the thing they always say is they play like guys. And that's not, a kind of like a value judgment or whatever. It's literally the style of play, the fluidity off the dribble, the creativity. Whereas many of the other women in the game, even great players, there was a level of kind of polished, mechanical, like a lack of kind of this fluidity. The only way I could describe it is imagining what watching an NBA game was like in 1975 and then turning on an ABA game. And you're like, oh, like that's basketball over here for us. With the modern eye, we watch the ABA game and we say, oh, that's basketball. What the hell are they doing over there? And that's not to say they weren't great players and Hall of Famers and, amazing. But it was so structured and starched in the NBA in the mid 70s. Same thing I think was happening in the WNBA 15 years ago, where there were a handful of players like they play like what we have associated with. This is what basketball looks like. And everybody else is playing this very structured kind of organized game that doesn't look of this time period. Now it's everywhere, as you said.
And then if I can jump in here on this, Howard, because this is why I always like thoroughly roll my eyes when anyone's like, I love the women's game because it's more fundamental. Because like, to me, I don't think that's true. And two, who turns on a game because it's so fundamental? It just seemed like
that's right.
And just to follow up on what Amin's saying, and like some of what I think is being now like pushed out of the game is like the reason you saw so many players playing the fundamental way is because that's what coaches at the base level were saying the women's game was about. And players who often had more creativity or were developing more what you might call one-on-one abilities in the game, that was coached out of them and told that it was like not fundamental and not part of like team play. And that hurt the women's game in the long run, that everybody was like, this is a fundamental game. You always make the extra pass and like you have to like always score in the flow of the offense. Like that's good to a point. And then you need players who can just take over. And that's where the women's game lagged.
And that is no different than in the 1960s and 1970s, where that was being coached out of NBA players. It's like, oh, you want to do that? Go play in the ABA. You want to go put the ball between your legs to change directions? Go play in the ABA. And obviously there's all kinds of racial and class codings that go with that. It's going to be very interesting to see just human evolution as well. Are you, how many, I don't know, how many female players can palm a basketball?
I mean, I have tiny hands and I can palm a basketball.
And you can palm a basketball. Like one of the biggest things, like if you go back and watch in terms of like, there are two things about the men's game that became standard. Number one, can you make your own shot? That was a prerequisite. In terms of talent evaluation, can you make your own shot? That was the difference between somebody, because the NBA, it was premium because there were no zones back then. So you had to be able to make your own shot if you were really going to become an elite player. The second thing, though, is as the evolution, the type of player, the type of athlete that comes into the women's game, as that continues to grow, you're going to have the separation, that athletic separation that is not just horizontal, but also vertical. Like that's the difference. Like when you started to see someone like a Dr. J or a Connie Hawkins or a Dominique Wilkins or Worthy, and they're holding the ball like a grapefruit and they can jump over you, that's a different sport.
And manipulate the ball.
And manipulate the ball and move in a way that allows you to break down defenses by yourself. Like if you watch the NBA in the 1960s, it wasn't that different, because players weren't taking over physically. Very few players would, watch Russell and Chamberlain. They're the two guys who are playing the really aerial game and everybody else is nailed to the floor. Right. And now Caitlin Clark is starting to create that sort of athletic separation. And once that becomes encouraged, you're going to have a different sport.
Yeah.
Kate, do you think when you watch Caitlin Clark, do you see a physical advantage that she has in terms of explosiveness and athleticism, or do you see someone who has a green light that just didn't exist for many players for many years?
I don't know what's going so I see a physical difference in terms of her north-south speed, not her vertical jump. Like we were talking in Dallas, because it's like my dreamland, right? Everybody there wants to talk about women's basketball. And like we're standing on the corners, like debating people's foot speed. It's a dream. But one of the things we were talking about was like, why isn't somebody just like knocking Caitlin Clark down, right? Like you didn't see that. And then you watch the game and you're like, she can
She's
get north
faster
to
than they are.
south
Mhm.
faster than they can go, right? So it's not like they can stay with her and then at the end just like, obviously they could have like nailed her to the ground and gotten a flagrant, but like
Right.
the separation I see that she's getting is like no matter, even the fastest LSU guards, the fastest South Carolina guards, like they can't stop her going to the rim. And that's
Mhm.
unlike anything I've seen from somebody who can also make separation and hit a 30-footer.
Right.
But I don't see her, like, I don't see the, it's not like I think Caitlin Clark has a great vertical jump, but I haven't seen anybody that fast with that level of skill.
Yeah, I saw two things in watching her. One of them was the speed. It was like, okay, she's getting separation, and all you need is a couple of steps when you've got a quick release. But the thing that I thought that was even more pronounced than her athleticism was 2 points. One, attitudinally. She's an attacker. Like she's an attack, she's in attack mode.
That's where that green light comes in.
And that's where the green light comes in. But the second thing that I saw too was because she was such an attacker, combine that with the mechanical teaching of the defenses, the rest of the help defenses weren't reacting to her because they're not used to being attacked that way. They're used to being attacked team-wise. So when she would, even in the South Carolina game, which, watching Don Staley's team, I was like, oh my God, they're talking about her team like it's Georgetown, 1983, right? Yeah. But, watch that game and the number of times she blows by one player and nobody's reacting because they're just not used to being attacked that specifically. I think they're used to being attacked and kicked, attack and kick, maybe move the ball and then attack. But she is going after the teeth of the defense on virtually every trip down court. And people just didn't react to it.
And talking about green light, I mean, and you're going to hop in here, but like, I don't know how many times during the tournament I saw Lisa Bluter, the Iowa coach, wanting a timeout and Caitlin Clark seeing something different and going to the rim. Like and maybe that happens on the men's game all the time, but let me tell you that if a coach in women's college basketball is telling you they want you to dribble over to the sideline and call a timeout, there are nary a player I have seen who has the green light to dismiss that coach and go take a shot. And Caitlin Clark is one of those players.
I wanted to just throw two quick things out before we depart. One is that at the end of the day, this was an unbelievable success for women's basketball and for basketball in general, because the one thing that I saw, and Bomani and I were talking about this not too long ago, was there was a name to the tournament on the women's side that you didn't get on the men's side. And the level of anonymity on the men's side, it was almost like the roles were reversed. And watching the men's tournament, I saw a lot of sensation, buzzer beaters, and great games. But here was a showstopper. Here was a name that we were here to watch. And that bodes really, really well for the future, because that's why we watch sports. We want to be told who to watch. Who am I supposed to care about? And that's how you build the game. The other thing that I thought was really sort of fascinating about this as well, and Amin, jump in, I know you had something you wanted to say, is the level in which you started the conversation with this, that all of the objections begin to just fall, right? And over time, you're looking at this, and it goes to something Kate said, a year ago when we started this podcast. If we give you something to watch, you'll watch it. We're giving you something to watch, put it on. And, there are dudes texting me. I'm like, how many games did you watch all year? Right? I mean, and that's not that different from the Super Bowl. It's not that different from any big event. It's not that different from World Cup. How many soccer games do I watch? I've been watching the World Cup. So at the very least, I don't want to go overboard on the vindication thing, because it's not like, this is something to be vindicated about, but it does show you that when you let the product, let people see the product, and they'll respond to it.
Yeah. My question lies in the changing dynamics of college sports, the NIL. And for football players, for men's basketball players, NIL is nice money. to make in the meantime, but the pros beckon where there's many, many more millions for the elites.
But didn't NIL change Miami's roster? Like, they made the Final Four over NIL, I think, right?
Yeah. But I guess my thing is, for women's college basketball, it's a different proposition because you're actually making, for the elites, you're making more money staying in college now than you would going pro. And through that, I see two things. One, beyond the obvious, the WNBA draft rules that require the players to stay in. Now there's an added incentive like, oh yeah, even if they change that rule, I'm staying. And so what does that do for women's college basketball, where we get to go back to a yesteryear, the 1970s and 80s, where it's like, oh yeah, if Villanova beats Georgetown, guess what? Georgetown's going to try and come back next year and do it all over again. You know, where we're already, like you said, Howard, we're circling, Miami, LSU, LSU and Iowa, and we're circling Iowa and South Carolina in a way that if these players had the wherewithal to leave, maybe that would be the case. But now, even if you gave them the wherewithal, I don't know that they would leave.
So are you
anyway.
saying that NIL is going to create the 4-year player?
It's going to,
the money is taking it away from the 4-year player on the men's side.
Yeah, it's going to actually strengthen the women's game in a way that I don't know what that means for the WNBA, whether that just means you have to wait longer for this fully marketed prepackaged product to get there, or is it going to hurt the WNBA and where people are tuning in more to this product because it's of a high quality and higher stakes than perhaps the WNBA. I don't know what you guys think about that.
I would argue it could only help the WNBA. Yeah. Go ahead, Kate.
I think there's, on the ESPN did a mega cast with Sue Bird and Diana Taurasi. I'm not sure if either of you watched any of that while you were watching the games.
I saw Charles Barkley on it, but I was watching the other broadcast.
Okay. Sue Bird was making the point that I'm all for NIL. The one thing that frustrates me about it is that people talk about the NIL and in conjunction with it, they disparage the WNBA. Why would you ever go to the WNBA? Because you can now make money in college. And I don't think those two things have to be true, that the WNBA isn't a destination for you because you can make more money in college. I see it as there are challenges that you can accept on either level, because the WNBA, at some point, Caitlin Clark, by the way, she has her COVID year. So we might have 2 more years of Caitlin Clark, which I guess it depends if Iowa wins, whether she would take that 5th year. But at some point, Caitlin Clark is going to want to see if she's truly the kind of generational talent that we think she is. And it's one thing to run over the 18-year-old freshman guard who's attempting to check you versus stepping into the WNBA where even first-round draft picks don't make the league because there's only 144 roster spots. So I think I see your point, Amin, but I think after everybody's COVID year is gone, which is a big thing because you've got all kinds of talent now that might stay 5 years, or maybe they're going to go after 4, but there is not a long history. I think Jewel Lloyd is the only player I can think of who left Notre Dame early to enter the WNBA draft. So it's not like we have I see it growing the college game, and then I see the WNBA game growing alongside of it as well because of the TV rights deals that we talk about all the time and the collective bargaining deals that are up, as well as the competitive standpoint of that league still being a destination.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the reason why I think that it's going to grow the WNBA is because of names. Why did, really, really, really good college basketball players didn't suffer when they joined the NBA. It was even more anticipated to see what they were going to do when they went to that next level. And so I think that the WNBA would love to have more and more bigger and bigger names in college because now there's another place where they can go. Maybe there's going to be a continuation of following them, right? So now you're going to watch the WNBA more because you want to see what Caitlin Clark does in the big show. That's
the bridge that the WNBA needs to keep building now, because it has been an abyss right? Like historically, it's been an abyss. Like you have Diana Taurasi, she's a big name, and then she lands in the W, and like the bridge has not been built.
That's right.
So I think that's the work over the next few years that the WNBA and its stakeholders, like that is the reverse engineering that they have to start figuring out, is building that bridge from fandom in Iowa, for example, and then fandom, let's say Caitlin Clark gets drafted by the Dallas Wings, right? Like she can't fall into an abyss there.
That's right. So here we go. 55 minutes in, we have covered a lot of ground, and I actually really do like this comp, and we'll see what happens, whether or not we look back 5-10 years from now at this championship game and see sort of if it has a legacy or not. Amin, final thoughts on LSU, Iowa, and the 2023 Final Four.
I summarized my thoughts with the first thing I said, which is we made a great leap when we can just have regular dumb sports talk radio conversations.
Yeah.
Okay,
There are other women's sports where when you try and follow them or tweet about them, you get your hand slapped because it's like you don't know enough. Women's soccer can be like that. And when it comes to women's basketball, I feel like we've got millions of people right now. They don't really know, like they don't know a lot about the history of it, but I think of it as a place where, like Amin said, if you want to come in here and tweet and offer your ridiculous meme and opinion, even though it's not historically based, like I think of it as a very like welcoming place compared to other women's sports. And I think that is the mindset that it has to have, which is men's sports has its ridiculousness and people that say
lots
the most
of it.
And like I guess that's the growth of women's sports, is when you have all those people walking through the door, you're gonna have a lot of hot takes coming with it.
Yeah, and you get a lot of eyeballs. And I think that the thing that we always talk about when it comes to sports is stars. And I think that the biggest question when it comes to stars has always been, are you watching the game or are you watching them? You saw it with golf with Tiger Woods. You saw it with Serena Williams. You see it everywhere. Are you sticking with the game once the star leaves? But all I can say is that the game that we got this last postseason, I think Caitlin Clark is going to be known in victory and in defeat as a Pied Piper in a lot of ways. People came to the sport and they're going to stay and they're going to watch because, once again, what we got to see was why we watch, right? It was no dud. It was no dud. The semifinal game was no dud, and the final, even though it was a 17-point game, was not a dud. And once you get that, they're here and they'll be back. And that, as they say, is that for Meadowlarkers 74. We will do the Mean Joe Green Meadowlarkers next week. And Kate Fagan and Amin Elhassan, thank you. We'll see you next week.